Now, to look at this further, we have with us Dr. Myong-hyun from the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Thank you for taking the time to come in today.
Thanks for having me.
So, Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-wha had stoked controversy after admitting during the National Assembly audit that the government is reviewing whether to lift the so-called May 24 sanctions on North Korea. Now, those sanctions came into place in 2010 when the North Korea made an unprovoked attack on South Korean warship, the Cheonan warship, that killed some 46 sailors. So it's a very sensitive topic in South Korean history. What do you make of Foreign Minister Kang's remarks? I mean, they sound quite careless, or should we consider them as some sort of calculated risk that they took?
Well, in a way, we know in the big picture, we know that North Korea and South Korea are trying to get into the next phase of inter-Korean engagement. We know from the content of the Pyongyang Declaration, the last inter-Korean summit, that much of the agreements actually takes place in the economic domain. So clearly, South Korea and North Korea are heading in that direction, and probably Minister Kang, with her statement, is trying to show that the South Korean government is seriously considering about different ways to expand the inter-Korean economic engagement. I think that's the context in which this came out. But the reason why it raised some alarm bells in some quarters, especially in Washington, is because there are cases in which the South Korean government gave this perception that was circumventing the sanctions regime, especially when it comes to Kaesong. When the South Korean government and North Korean government set up the liaison's office in Kaesong, South Korean government actually transferred the construction materials without reporting the transfer to the United Nations. And we also know that the news came out recently that the South Korean government restarted the water treatment facility in Kaesong, which is not only supplies water to the liaison's office, but the rest of the Kaesong city. So that could be considered as a way to transfer economic resources to North Korea. So I think in combination to these cases, I think that's the reason why the Minister Kang's remarks have received some criticisms.
Yes, and one of those critics may be US President Donald Trump himself.
Yes.
He gave quite a bristled response to this news as well. When asked about whether South Korea would be allowed to lift sanctions, he said, I quote, "They won't do that without our approval. They do nothing without our approval." Now, this is quite a strong tone, not very diplomatic answer. But does it perhaps reveal a truth? Can South Korea make this kind of decisions by themselves, or do they need approval from the US to do these kind of things?
Well, in principle, it's up to the member states to decide whether to observe the sanctions or not. And if the member state of the United Nations is found to violating the sanctions, then we need a resolution from the Security Council to the violating nation. So it takes a lot of steps to reach that state. So what's really holding South Korea back from engaging North Korea economically is actually the unilateral sanctions by the United States. And the reason why the President Trump showed this kind of a very undiplomatic reaction to the news that the South Korea might consider lifting some of the economic sanctions is because for the US, the only leverage that the country has over North Korea are the sanctions. So I think the US government, including President Trump, doesn't want to see any erosion to the current sanctions regime because they are aware that without sanctions, North Korea might not even commit to any minimum level of denuclearization.
So we are maybe perhaps seeing some sort of strain between the South Korea and the US relationship, and that was also, again, further stressed by Kang also yesterday, confirming that she had a phone call with her US counterpart, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who complained about South Korea reaching a military agreement with North Korea at the last inter-Korean summit last month. So she said that he expressed a discontent about how he was not briefed sufficiently and that he had a lot of questions in general. Does this level of discord between the two sides kind of is it a concern? Because the fact that she confirmed it is also a surprise.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. I mean, the fact that she confirmed that there was a strong disagreement between the Foreign Minister of Korea and Secretary of State of the United States over the inter-Korean summit. That's actually a very worrisome sign that clearly there's a mismatch in speed between denuclearization and the inter-Korean dialogue, and the fact that through this exchange, what was revealed is that the U.S. side is trying to put a brake on the development in the inter-Korean dialogue. So that actually should come as not as a surprise, but also a strong message from Washington that so South Korea should slow down when it comes to engaging North Korea.
Is this an inevitable position that South Korea finds themselves in, though, because they're acting as a mediator between North Korea and the US? So they're going to be pushed and pulled from either side. Are they going to have to be pushing some buttons from either side to try and get progress moving forward?
But yeah, clearly, I mean, one way to rationalize about the predicament that South Korea is in right now is that it's a downside of being a mediator between the two adversaries. But at the same time, a mediator should have the leverage on both sides, both adversaries, to somehow make somehow force them to come together and discuss their problems and solve the problems. But what we see right now is that South Korea doesn't really have the leverage on either side. I mean, there's some leverage on North Korea, but it's not very strong. On the U.S., we don't have any leverage, so to speak. Actually, it's the other way. It's the United States has leverage on South Korea. So in that sense, I think, in a way, we have reached a situation where South Korea has bitten off too much more than it can actually chew, in a way.
Interesting. So meanwhile, while all this is happening, North Korea's Vice Foreign Minister Cheonan met with her Chinese and Russian counterparts in Moscow the other day as well, earlier this week. And on Wednesday, they released a joint communique which calling on the UN to adjust its sanctions on North Korea at an appropriate time. So this comes while all this controversy with Kang Kyung-wha and her comments about sanctions are happening as well. Is this just merely a coincidence, or is this something that North Korea and the Chinese and Russian plans are using to pressure the US as well?
Well, I would like to think it's actually a coincidence that there's no explicit coordination between Seoul and, say, like Pyongyang or Moscow over this. But then I think, the coincidence of, all like China, Russia, North Korea, and South Korea all talking about relaxation of sanctions is actually points towards the fact that all these countries have a common set of priority when it comes to the situation in the Korean Peninsula. It's about stability rather than denuclearization. And then I think all sides agree that sanctions are actually creating instability in the peninsula, so therefore sanctions should be relaxed. So in that sense, I think it's a very revealing case in which how each country has a priority, what kind of priority each country has when it comes to North Korea.
So this is all leading, hopefully, towards possibly a second summit between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un as well. And so, but one of the interesting things that turned up this week was Trump has revealed that this next summit won't happen until after the midterm elections on November 6th. So he's implied that just not enough time to leave the country, in this when he's so busy with the elections. But do you think it just shows how far away the two sides are in reaching some sort of agreement towards the denuclearization process?
I think it's actually an indication that two sides haven't been able to bridge the gap when it comes to positions regarding denuclearization. Because they also report on the Russian media when Cheonan was in Russia for discussion with her Russian and Chinese counterparts, that apparently Cheonan indicated to her Russian counterparts that the U.S. DPRK summit would take place, the second one would take place before the November elections. But now we're hearing from Washington that's not going to be the case. So this clearly indicates that there's in a way, the tug of war between Pyongyang and Washington about about the second DPRK-US summit. And the reason is because I think both sides are trying to use the occasion of the summit as a way to pressure the other side and impose their terms of a negotiation on the other. So I think this is exactly what's going on. They're trying to bridge the gap between the two sides, but at the same time, each side wants to favor their own agenda over the other.
The argument was, though, that if they do it before the midterm elections, because having this a deadline almost as a midterm elections, it would force both sides to kind of reach a quick compromise. Whereas now, if they don't have the deadline for the midterm elections, Donald Trump and the North Korea might drag out this process to try and get a second summit. Do you think there is a risk of that? So
actually, it's the other way. I mean, you're right in the sense that the November elections was acting as a deadline on both sides. But the fact is that North Korea wanted to use the November election as a deadline, but the U.S. has refused to do so. And that means that the second U.S. DPRK summit might not even take place in November, because if it's going to take place after November, as you have indicated, there's no pressure on the U.S. side to have the summit with Pyongyang. So essentially, the U.S. actually gets the older initiative when it comes to the negotiation with North Korea. So I think that's exactly a place that North Korea doesn't want to be. North Korea wants to be proactive, wants to have the initiative, but after November elections, North Korea won't be the one having the initiative anymore.
But what do you think will happen with the results of the actual midterm elections for Donald Trump as well? Do you think that will change his hand when he's dealing with North Korea as well, especially if he loses the House or the Senate? Will that have to change his tactics on North Korea, do you think?
Well, slightly maybe. I mean, but then we know that after the November election results comes out, I think the news cycle is going to be basically dominated by the explanation and interpretation of the outcome of November elections, and the attention on the North Korean issue is going to naturally drift away, and that's not going to be good for North Korea's negotiating position. So I think Trump understands that no matter what happens after the November elections, if somehow Trump is no longer subject to the pressure of having some sort of a negotiative outcome or agreement with North Korea before November, then Trump will have a lot more power or leverage over North Korea. So I think that's the reason why Pyongyang feels a little bit of hurry in a way to reach an agreement with Washington before the elections in November.
If they are in a hurry, as it seems, but they also seem to be dragging their feet as well, because the U.S. has been asking for working level talks between U.S. and North Korea. They've said we should have talks in Vienna between Stephen Biegun, the U.S. Special Representative of North Korea, and Cheonan, the Deputy Foreign Minister we just talked about earlier. But it doesn't seem to be happening. There doesn't seem to be any news on it. Do you think that will happen soon, or is that shows still how far they can't even get working level talks to happen?
Clearly, North Korea doesn't want to talk about denuclearization. We know that North Korea has been avoiding the subject for a long time. Actually, after the Singapore summit, North Korea doesn't want to talk about denuclearization because their objective is to somehow drag this process on until it gets acknowledged as a nuclear state, a de facto nuclear state by Washington through the very prolonged process of negotiation. So that's why there's a difference in agenda here. It's not like North Korea is dragging its feet when it comes to the working group talks. She actually North Korea is trying to send a message to Washington that denuclearization it's not going to be the main agenda for discussion between the two countries, which the United States doesn't agree. So that's why the United States is trying to put the agenda back on the table, and then North Korea is not really playing along. So I think that's going to be the state of affairs between the two countries for the foreseeable future.
Okay, so one more final piece of topic before we go. One topic that's actually been gaining a little bit of traction as well in Korea. So interest in Kim Jong-un's invitation for Pope Francis to visit North Korea is growing. I mean, the Vatican has so far declined to comment, saying they're going to wait for an official invitation from Kim Jong-un before they make any sort of announcement. Do you think it could happen?
Oh, it could definitely happen. I think the Pope is very interested in the situation in the Korean Peninsula because it's a one conflict zone that Vatican could actually help with the stability and bringing peace to the peninsula. So I think that's the reason why Pope is personally interested in this issue. And also the fact is that it was President Moon's initiative to make the suggestion to Kim Jong-un to extend the invitation to the Pope Francis to come to Pyongyang. And we know that President Moon is actually a Catholic too. So I think it's a combination of factors here that I think President Moon is trying to keep the momentum going, a momentum of peace going in the Korean Peninsula by inviting Pope to come to North Korea. And that way they can consolidate the perception that North Korea, regardless of progress being made on the denuclearization front, is actually committed to the peace and stability in the region.
Why would Kim Jong-un want Pope Francis to come to North Korea? There is no religious freedom in North Korea after all.
Well, there's no democracy in North Korea either, but at the same time, Kim Jong-un invited President Moon to Pyongyang, also he wants to invite President Trump to Pyongyang. So it's all about the diplomatic impact of having a major religious figure, a symbol of peace, and also somebody who's been very proactive to bring peace and stability in the entire world. So bringing somebody like that to Pyongyang is going to really strengthen the image of Kim Jong-un as somebody who's open and also interested in peace and stability rather than making North Korea a nuclear threat.
Do you think he might also be trying to copy his grandfather as well? Because Tae Yong-ho, the British ambassador who defected from North Korea, he he said in his memoirs that it was actually Kim Il Sung's wish to get the Pope back then to come to North Korea as well. Do you think there's some of that in play as well?
Well, I think the North Korean leadership historically was interested in a long list of, say, like a global luminaries to come to Pyongyang and to somehow improve the image of the regime in the eyes of the international community. So I think it's actually not really about, I don't think it's really about copying his grandfather. It's about the same program or same objectives the leadership has right now to somehow improve the international community's perception of the regime.
Well, we'll have to see if there is a papal visit to Pyongyang. That would be quite interesting.
That would be interesting.
Yes, thank you for coming in today and giving us your time as always.
Thanks, my pleasure.